Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today in War Thunder, we're looking at the KV-1 L-11. The first KV-1 you get in this game. It is named L-11 basically after its gun, its 76mm L-11 cannon. It's a BR of 3.3 in arcade and 2.7 in realistic. It is very, very competitive. Basically because, well, it's a barn on wheels. Even though it's very big, it has so much armor. It basically can stop so many shots from long range and most shots at short range. This thing is the kind of tank I drive when I'm feeling a bit stressed and I just want to go in and brawl with some other tanks and knock them over and turn them over. Because this thing weighs 44.4 tons. It's a heavy behemoth. Compared to the T-34 1942, that's 26.5. Okay, this thing is nearly twice that. And also with a max speed of 41 kilometers an hour means only one thing: ramming speed. It's a wonderful machine just for derping around in, to be honest. Now, looking at modifications, usually what I go for ammo-wise is the armor-piercing high explosive. Basically the first one you get, because if you look at the AP-BC, you get the armor-piercing ballistic cap shell. You get a little bit more penetration, like 5mm, but 5mm is not going to make that much of a difference with the stuff that you're coming up against at 3.3. So why not have that high explosive as well to do a bit more damage? Now, the 76mm gun isn't brilliant on this, but it is good enough to take apart anything you're really going to come up against. Obviously, your big competitors are the Panzer IV Ausf F2 with the big donkey 75mm KW-K40 L43 gun, and the Panzer III Ausf L at 3.3. You can also come up against some of the later models, such as the Ausf M Panzer III and the Ausf G, but still, they're not going to struggle to penetrate you, but you're going to struggle to penetrate them. But who the hell cares? KV-1 doesn't care, so why should I care? But anyway, let's get into some arcade battles. And so here we are in arcade with the behemoth, the KV-1 L-11. Now, with a BR of 3.3, you start coming up against the German tanks, which can actually deal with the KV-1, weirdly enough. You have the Panzer IV Ausf F2, you have the Panzer the Panzer III Ausf L. You know, these things can actually take out the KV-1. But the thing is, you can still do really well in it. The reason that I really love the KV-1 is probably the reasons why a lot of people, they like it for other reasons. I mean, for me, in arcade, this thing is a brawler. This thing gets into the action, it takes the hits, keeping your medium tanks around you alive. Basically, it is a team tank. The idea is, if a medium tank is getting pummeled and you need to save it, you chuck your tank in front of it to make sure that it stays alive, to get that extra shot off, which may make a massive difference. Now, the L-11 gun isn't actually that good, and when you actually look at the ammo that it holds, it's kind of sketchy. It's a lot like a lot of the tanks in War Thunder, where the ammo that you get at the start, the APHE, is a hell of a lot better than anything else you get. And that's basically true with most of the Russian tanks, because they start off with APHE, and they get, the higher penetration stuff, but it's ballistically capped and not high explosive. So high explosive does that extra damage if you penetrate, so you might as well just load that full. Also, you get a lot of shots in the KV-1, so running out of ammo in an arcade battle is nigh on impossible unless you fire every second of every game. Also, another thing to take into account is this thing is goddamn slow until you start getting modifications. When you start getting the engine, the transmission, stuff like that, then it actually is able to accelerate a bit better. But before those upgrades, Jesus Christ, this thing does not move well. So that means that peeking in and out of corners, you can't do really well. Basically, it's more of a trading shots tank at that point. But when you start getting the upgrades, when you start getting the performance of this thing up, you can start peekabooing in a way. And with this ammo and with this gun, you can do a hell of a lot of damage. The thing is, these German tanks that can take you out, they do not have a lot of armor themselves. I mean, the Ausf 2 has terrible armor. So it is very much whoever gets the first shot off, and a lot of times you'll bounce the first shot anyway. When you actually look at the KV-1, the only real points where it is really, really vulnerable are its turret ring, which is nigh impossible to hit, or its cheeks on the side of the turret and on the front, which once again gives you a very small area to aim at. And if you do penetrate that, most of the time it won't hit the crew, because the crew are more in a central part of this tank around the gun. So getting penetrations into the cheeks won't do a lot for you. But as you can see in this game, I'm playing very defensively. Our team is basically dominating, so there's no point in doing anything rash. I don't have to use my tank how it's supposed to be intended. Use it to push points, to help out medium tanks when they need it. Even light tanks, you could probably hide about 3 T-70s behind this thing and it would be completely fine. But instead what I'm doing is I'm getting into positions to take a few shots, not waste my tank, because the thing is you only get one of them in arcade and realistic and simulator because it is classed as a heavy tank. So if you lose it, then you're down to your mediums and your SPGs, so that's another thing to take into account. So you don't just want to throw your tank away. I see a lot of KV-1 drivers at the start of battles. They go for the points, but the KV-1 isn't fast enough. So when it gets there, usually a battle is already taking place, which basically means that you're in a position where you have to assault an enemy which is already in defensive positions. And if you don't have very good support around you from your allies, then, well, you're going to get picked apart. The side armor on the turret is very good, but if something hits you point blank and straight on the turret, that ain't going to bounce. That's going to go in and it's going to hurt your crew. Obviously, this is a big tank, so what I like using is using some old World of Tanks tactics. Basically, showing them your tracks. If they hit your tracks, then yes, you're immobilized for a little bit, but it doesn't do any significant damage. And because of the rate of fire of this gun, it means that you can put a lot of shots into them while they're doing that. Another thing that I found a lot of players doing against the KV-1 is the whole idea of artillery, these artillery strikes that are in the game. Now obviously the KV-1 doesn't get access to these artillery strikes because it's classed as a heavy tank. And against it, artillery strikes can be very devastating because it does have a very large hull, it does have a very large chassis, and even quite a large turret, and the armor on the back is not great. So if you get an artillery shell on your behind, it is going to do a lot of damage. But once again, that's very much RNG based. And as you can see, I'm just bouncing shots here. Like, they are hitting me, they're really not doing a lot of damage, and I can trade shots. Isn't that a great thing to do? Like, when I am driving the Germans, I feel like I cannot trade shots. I cannot do that at all. Basically, I have to get the first shot off first, and then I have to dip back into cover, work out their reload speed, see if I can get another one, and then shoot if I can, and if not, hope that they miss and then hit them again. With the KV, I can sit there on a bloody hill like this, trade shots against even F2s, and they can bounce, and I can bounce a few, and, you know, it's basically like that, because you have the armor to support doing stuff like this. Obviously, gun elevation and depression isn't brilliant, but what do you expect? It's a heavy tank. It's not really supposed to have stuff like that. And when you look at things like its overall speed and acceleration, once you get those modifications, it is absolutely wonderful in that role. And even though my team did dominate that match, this does show that the KV-1 can hold down a sector. It can hold down the south of that map very, very easily. And it can, even with its very quite slow turret traverse, it is able to cover itself from behind. Now obviously, one of the ways of assaulting a KV-1 is getting around it. It's very much like an SPG in that way. The turret does not turn well. And obviously, the weak spot of the KV-1, just like a lot of tanks, is the back of its turret or the back of its hull. So what you want to do is try and flank it. Now if you stay with your allies, with the medium tanks, the T-34s, even the Panzer IIIs and 4s, then the enemy isn't going to be able to do that. So that's something to take into account. Now that match obviously did go really, really well for us. So let's get into a match where the positions and the outcome are not exactly the same. We actually have to work a bit in the KV-1. Now, a lot of people will say that the KV-1 is under-tiered, it's overpowered, blah blah blah, but it definitely isn't. When you actually look at its armor, it can get penetrated by most or even all APCR shots. It can also get penetrated by the F2 default ammo. It can get penetrated by any SPG, basically. So, I don't really know what you're talking about. With a BR of 3.3, you can come up against stuff like Hetzers. Hetzers will chew this thing to bits. And that's unfortunately kind of the risk-reward you gotta run with this thing. Like, sometimes it pays off, sometimes it doesn't. In any tank that you play in War Thunder, you do have to just say to yourself, if I get one shot, oh well, that just happens. But you can reduce the fact of that happening. You can reduce the amount of times that can happen to you. And the way you can reduce that is obviously by using this very powerful engine to its effect, dipping in and out of cover, only exposing your turret, only doing little things like that. War Thunder in tanks is made up by very slight things. It's kind of like, let's say there's a guy around a corner, and you decide to go around and he kills you. But if he came around, you would have killed him, won that corner, and pushed the flank and beaten the enemy back. It's just little moments like that which make War Thunder how it is. So, with the KV-1, there's no reason to do anything rash. This is not a tank which you charge into battle with, the 4 horsemen on your back. This is a tank which you just chill. You take a chill pill. You drive it along. You support your allies, and if they need help, you dive in. It's not a medium tank. This is probably one of the first heavies that many people are going to encounter, so maybe that's why a lot of people, in my opinion, don't really drive it right. But as we can see in this map, I'm being a lot more offensive, definitely not being as defensive, because my team isn't doing as well. So I, as a heavy tank, have to take it on my shoulders to be like, right, I need to do something right now. I need to push this advantage and need to push the enemy back. So, what can I do? I can push points. I can help medium tanks. I can push them forward. If they see me going forward, they will come with me. Because they see the KV-1 and they think that thing can take 50 shells. That thing can keep me alive. And that's exactly how I feel when driving one of these things. I feel like I can help my team in a very positive way. As long as I don't run into logs and basically break my tank. But that's just sometimes happens. Another thing to take into account with this thing, it's very, very heavy. I believe 44 point something tons. And when you get up to a speed of 41 kilometers an hour, ramming something which is 20 tons, well, you can guess what's going to happen. It's absolutely wonderful, beautiful to see. And it's something you can do in the KV-1, because when I drive it, I basically get into a mode where I'm like, I really don't give a shit right now. Like when I'm driving a T-34, the Panzer IIIs, the Panzer IVs, any SPGs, I feel like I have to concentrate a lot on my positioning, on where I'm going, on angles, everything like that. With the KV-1, you can be a bit more chill about it. You can be a bit more relaxed about it. And definitely in arcade. Obviously realistic and simulator, it's a bit of a different story. But in arcade, you can just chill. You can hold a lane by yourself just by being there. The enemy will target you first because they see you as the biggest threat. Even though your gun isn't that powerful, that's how they will see you. They will see, oh, big tank, we need to kill it. Kind of like how people see the KV-2 and the SU-122. Stuff like that. So just take that into account. If you do come up against a lot of enemies and there's a lot of allies, you'll probably get targeted down first because you're seen as the biggest threat, for no real apparent reason. Now, this, in my opinion, is a brawling tank, because of its penetration is very bad, at long ranges. So, if you can get close and personal with other tanks, you can use that APHE ammo to great effect in arcade. And as you can see, as I was talking about before, here comes the artillery barrage to just screw me. But also, another thing to take into account is obviously the KV-1. It doesn't turn well, its turret doesn't turn well, its speed isn't great, it does take a long time to get up to that 41 kilometers an hour. So, a lot of tanks can just outflank you and forget about you. And that's exactly what's happened here. There have been tanks which are basically just outflanked and taken the point behind me, and there's nothing I can do about it because my track's been hit by artillery. I'm in a position where I can't really help, but now I can. But I have to see, if my allies aren't around me, there is literally no point in me going in there. Because I will just die and, well, the team will just lose a tank. Like, nothing else will happen. But luckily, my team are applying some pressure, and I'm able to push forward, take a few pot shots, hit these guys, and use this great reload and great tank to its advantages. Bit of peekabooing, bit of popping outing, basically just critting areas. A good thing I like to do in the KV-1 is basically like take out a horizontal turret drive on a Panzer and then just leave him for my team to mop up. I feel like that works really well. Even, I suppose if you want to get kills, obviously you can finish stuff off. But for me, usually when I'm advancing with my team. So if I can knock out a enemy tank in that way, like hit the cannon breach or something, then there is literally no point in me finishing it off. Because then they just respawn, they know where I am, and they'll go for me. Now that, I have no idea how that doesn't knock out all of the crew. With a high explosive shot, but it didn't, and it gave me an opportunity to do this and be like, you know what, you ain't getting away, Sonny Jim. T-34, let's see how your speed does when you're on the side of my tank. And I can just keep plowing shot after shot into him. There's nothing he can do. 44 tons just sat on him, and I can just keep planking shots. Somehow I donk that shot, but hey, it's the KV-2 gun, sometimes that happens. But screw this T-34. I've had enough of his shenanigans. I don't give any fucks right now. I'm in a KV-1. I do what I want. And then some guys decide to try and flank. Nope, that ain't gonna happen. Even though this turret traverse is quite slow, and even slower in Realistic and Simulator, it still turns enough to be able to combat the enemy. And basically, with the support of my team here, I was easily able to take this point back, easily take out those 4 attackers, easily take out the other flanking force which was coming around, and secure this point. So it shows the KV-1 by itself, not a great machine. Like, it can easily get outflanked, it can easily get immobilized through its tracks, its cannon breach is a bit susceptible, and so is its turret drives if they hit you in the turret ring. So there's another thing to consider. But when it's not on its own, when you're surrounded by allies, and those allies are there to help you, you can do something brilliant. And as you can see, we can easily push forward. Even though there are people trying to flank us, who gives a crap? We're in tanks, we're ready to move. And if you flank, you won't be able to kill all of us, and that's just how it's gonna be. Basically, that's how I see this tank. It is a brawler. It is... may I just say, what is this guy doing? Is he just oblivious to the fact that I'm behind him? Like, I have no idea what that guy was doing. And he still doesn't see me after one hit. Like, I shot straight into his back and he's like, oh, I don't know what's going on. But I'm taking hits. And those hits are valuable because they're hits which aren't going into the medium tanks, which I just supported. And also, I can take the hits. This thing is kind of susceptible to fires, but to be honest, I can't seem to find many tanks which aren't susceptible to fires at the moment. So, yeah, maybe that needs to be changed. But, once again, that's just my opinion. Boomtown, destroy that guy, the T-34, and an easy victory there. It wasn't looking like an easy victory, but because we were able to secure that point, because we were able to take out that T-34 before he could get behind us, it was an easy victory. And that just shows the KV-1 can be the talisman that you need in your team. Just all it takes is one to push while everybody else pushes with it to go forward. It's kind of, it like unionizes the team in a way. Like the whole idea that, it basically, some people need a force to push them to do stuff. And in this game, pushing forward can be as easy as just getting a KV-1 and moving it forward, so the team will follow you. Basically, put the team on your back and take them for a ride. That always seems like a good idea. But anyway, let's get on to some performance testing. And so on to the performance testing part, where we'll be putting this thing to its limits. Now, first of all, let's see how long it takes to get to its max speed. Looking at the engine and everything like that, obviously this is a very heavy tank weighing in at 44 tons, so it will take a while to get to max speed for obvious reasons. I am in realistic battle mode right now, so yeah, it takes a while. Obviously more than something like an Su-76 or a T-34, but still it can canter with its engine upgrades pretty quickly. Looking at the shells you get, you start off with some high explosive shots, and then also basically some APHE, which is very useful. And I'm not sure if it's ballistically capped or not, giving you a bit of extra penetration, but if it isn't, it doesn't really matter anyway, because as you can see, APHE pierces the armor of the tank and then just blows it up. You also get some shrapnel shots, which, well, if you feel like going after aircraft, good luck with that. That's all I can say. Firing on the move, not too great, because the suspension of this thing, as you can see, it rocks quite hard once you stop. It's much better than a lot of the German tanks, but still the suspension can be really annoying. So shooting, you kind of do have to stop and then fire. Your upgraded ammo that you get is some armor-piercing ballistic capped shots. But the thing is, you get an extra maybe 10 or 5 millimeters of penetration at certain ranges, but the thing is you lose that high explosive capability. So I'm really not sure if it's a great idea to take that. I'd rather have the high explosive, because if it does penetrate, which most of the time it's going to, because you're looking at the stuff you're going to come up against, you're looking at 60 millimeters of armor, maybe 70 or 80 with spaced, you're still going to be able to penetrate that from at least 500 or 100 meters, so at least you have a chance. But I don't know, if you feel like that extra 5 or 10 millimeters of penetration makes a difference, go for it, but for me it doesn't around this BR. Another thing to take into account is you can pen the side of one of these big boys, which is always nice to see. Which you seem to be able to do with quite a lot of things, but it's nice to be able to, just in case you get into matches with them, which hopefully you never should, but the thing is you never know. Looking at its BR, you come mainly up against stuff that you can take out. T-34s are always going to be a problem. It's probably the first tank that I've come across which, if it shot at itself, it wouldn't be able to penetrate itself. So yeah, if you come up against another KV-1, maybe it would be a good idea to switch to that ballistic cap stuff. That may help out, but no, I would rather support my medium tanks, get them to take out the KV-1, and then I can push up. And that was a total donk shot there. Looking at the muzzle velocity of these things, the muzzle velocity of the rounds is 650 meters per second across the board, which, comparing to the Germans, where their standard ones are mid-800s, and then their APCR rounds are mid-1100s, it's not very fast. So getting the arc right, such as, getting your arc right in realistic and simulator, can get a bit, you have to get used to it, and also at longer ranges, you don't have as much penetration, so maybe it's not really worth trying to shoot at those long ranges. But if you hit, obviously APHE going to do a lot of damage. Weak points of the tank, I have been set on fire quite a lot, as I said before in the arcade part. The turret ring is very weak, but as you can see, it's very hard to hit. You can get ammo racked from the side of the turret, so watch out for that. And even though this thing has a lot of armor, don't think you're indestructible. People start getting big guns. They start getting APCR rounds. Even a T-50 can penetrate you if he decides to. The turret cheeks around the gun mantlet are obviously quite a problem. But apart from that, this thing is pretty tough. As long as you angle it alright, let's say 30-degree angle around a corner. Obviously, turret facing them, you don't want to give them the side of your turret. This thing isn't an E100 or something like that. You want to basically angle towards them, have your gun facing them. It's very hard to pen that gun mantlet, but if they do, they will breach the cannon, but, you know, that's all RNG based, basically. The cannon is actually very short, which is quite interesting. I wonder what the upgraded KV-1s look like. But yeah, this thing's quite a little sturdy thing. I mean, as long as you don't expose your back to people, you should be completely fine. Obviously, the back of the turret and the turret ring under it is going to be penned quite easily, but you should always be facing the enemy anyway. Taking out this tank, you do have to flank it and hope that he doesn't have many friends around, but if he does, you know, it's not a massive issue. You should still be able to work it around as long as you work as a team. Let's just take another pot shot at this big boy. As you can see, the gun is a bit all over the place on the move, even though I'm not really moving that fast. Oh, right into the side and did absolutely nothing. Oh well. But yeah, this thing's a decent tank, mobility-wise. As long as you get those upgrades. Key upgrades, obviously the engine and the transmission in this thing. I think you can skip on the new shells if you want, and just go straight for stuff like the suspension and stuff like that, because I think that will be the most useful for you. Performance upgrades over ammo upgrades, basically. That's the way I see this tank. But anyway, let's get on to some historical fact-finding. So after doing some historical fact-finding, I found some quite interesting things about the KV-1, or at least the L-11 version. Basically in-game, it's the two KV-1s you have the L-11 and the ZIS, and they're basically named after their guns. The reason this is because the KV-1 as itself, it was not recognized with the different production models. So if you saw a ZIS on the battlefield, then it would just be called a KV-1, just as like an L-11 would. The way a lot of historical writers and stuff basically label them is by year. So the L-11 is actually the 1939 KV-1, which basically it was found to be highly resistant. Well, think about 1939. What did the Germans have, or anybody else? The Germans had the Panzer II-C and the early Panzer III models, so yeah, there's no way of getting through there. But the L-11 was obviously, it had the 76mm L-11 tank gun, and only 141 were built. It did actually, it was basically used in the Winter War. If you guys don't know what that is, I would definitely recommend looking it up. Very interesting. This model of the KV-1, basically it stuck through. The only thing that really changed was certain parts of armor, introducing machine guns, like the L-11 version, or the 1939 version, only had one machine gun just next to the driver's driver's hatch, whereas the ZIS and such like that had machine guns actually in the turret. The KV-1 didn't really have a lot of opposition in the heavy tanks that were around at this time. The only one that it was not really up against, but can be compared to the KV-1, was the Char B1 from the French, and it outclassed it in every way. The reason the KV-1 wasn't so prevalent and everything as time went on was because the Germans started making these 75mm long barrel guns, the 50mm that you see on the Panzer III, Aus L, and the F2 and the G. These were capable of penetrating KV-1s quite easily, whereas the KV-1's gun just it could penetrate the Germans, but the thing is, it was engaging the Germans at a very long range, so it wasn't able to. Obviously, the KV-1 L-11, the first of its time, was made in 1939 and only really used in 1939. So out to all of you people who want historical matchmaking, I'd like to see what you would say about this, because I would rather not face Panzer IICs. I wouldn't like to face KV-1s in a Panzer IIC, thank you. So let's see what you think about that on the BR system and stuff like that. Basically, it was developed after the multi-turreted T-35 heavy tank kind of just was disappointing to people. They thought it was a cool idea, but it didn't really work, you know. Like, it was basically technology ahead of its time, because it needed so much crew and everything like that. And the Russians were looking for a breakthrough tank. They were looking for something with heavy firepower, big armor protection, but didn't really mind about mobility, because you've got to remember at this time, the Russians were looking at stuff like T-34s, which were basically the whole package. So when they started making the KV-1, or the Kliment Voroshilov tank, as we know, the tanks and the planes of the Russians were actually named after their designers, which is quite interesting. But in this case, the KV-1 was actually named after the Soviet Defense Commissar, and also a politician, obviously, the Kliment Voroshilov, which is quite interesting. Usually they're named after the designers, but in this case not. Obviously, the KV-1 created the KV-2, the howitzer or the artillery piece, used the same chassis and everything like that, with a few differences. But the reason you don't really hear a lot about the KV-1 is basically in history, the KV-1s were good, but the T-34s were better. Now, a lot of people see the T-34s as the best tank of World War II, and to be honest, I can't really disagree with that. It was a very good tank. But when you look at the KV-1, it's basically better in every way apart from mobility, which is what the Russians needed in their vast lands and being able to break through German lines or even defend. They needed to get places and people in places fast to either dig in or attack, whereas the KV-1 was not good for stuff like that. It was a heavy tank, it was a slow tank, its power to weight was 13 horsepower per ton. Now, that is awful. Like, just little stuff like that. It didn't really help this thing. And also, there are stories about the crews not being trained very well for the KV-1s. The KV-1s were definitely seen as an afterthought compared to the T-34. But anyway, yeah, this is the 1939 version with the L-11 gun, and it is quite an interesting machine. I enjoy driving it in-game, but probably wouldn't have in the war. So, let's get on to some realistic battles. And here we are in some realistic battles. I have two for you today, because basically I'm doing two battles instead of doing the simulator battle parts. As a quick recap why I won't be doing that, simulator battles is not a place for heavy tanks, in my opinion. It's a place for medium tanks, which can penetrate heavy tanks, which have speed, maneuverability, and everything like that. The KV-1 is not a simulator battle tank. That's just my opinion. I can understand if other people think differently. But anyway, onto the realistic battles part. Now, it could be said, even the KV-1 L-11 isn't great in realistic, but I have to disagree in that way. It does have a few disadvantages compared to other tanks. Obviously, it doesn't get that artillery strike, which can be key against other enemies, but the thing it does have is its BR. Its BR in realistic and simulator is 2.7, compared to in arcade where it's 3.3. This means that you can come up against the lower tier Panzers, the Panzer IIIs and the Panzer IVs, which do not have the 75mm donkey gun and do not have the 50mm. Now, most of the time you are still going to come up against the Aus L and the Aus F2, but let's say you get into a match with an Aus F or something like that, they can't even hurt you. You can just sit there and do absolutely nothing and just take all the hits because they can't penetrate you. Now, isn't that kind of sad? And I believe the reason Gaijin has changed its BR so dramatically in realistic is because they've kind of realized that realistic and simulator is a place for medium tanks. But because they have drastically lowered this thing to 2.7, it means that this thing can be an absolute powerhouse. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not going to come up against the big panzers, just as my friend at the side just found out right there. You are still going to come up against them, the ones that can penetrate you, but you're also going to come up against them which can't. And they can just look at you and they can't do anything. Maybe they'll be able to hit your tracks and knock you out. Well, so what? Like, I can repair my tracks while I'm shooting at them. Now, another thing to take into account is I stress massively in arcade the whole idea of teamwork, the whole idea of pushing as one. Now, in realistic, that doesn't happen as much for some reason. You'd think it would be the other way around, but in my experience, teamwork is less in realistic than it is in arcade. And the thing is, when you look at the tanks that the KV-1 comes up with, you're looking at the early T-34s, maybe the Su-76, even the Su-122, stuff like that. And you can support them very well, or you can take hits. You can do exactly what you do in arcade, and basically, instead of your medium tanks getting hit, you can be the guy to put your tank out there and be like, come at me, bro, which helps a lot. Another thing to take into account is, obviously the KV-1 is not that maneuverable. It is a slow tank, and you do want to be engaging at short ranges, because 650 meters per second of muzzle velocity isn't great at the best of times. So, shooting accurately, doing it at short ranges obviously helps a lot. But anyway, as I was saying before, this thing isn't maneuverable, which means that if you get maps like Kursk, or the new map that they put in, where there are some very open spaces that you have to cross, you're going to struggle, really. Like, there's going to be a lot of times where you have to learn the map, you have to know where the hill is, or where you can basically get in so the enemy can't hurt you, which you will see in the second realistic battle I play. Obviously, a big advantage of this thing is its armor. Its armor is absolutely wonderful. You can basically bounce anything that comes at you, and there is sloping here and there. There are obviously weak points of this thing, but in realistic it is even harder to hit them, because in arcade you get that hit marker, you can sort out where you're going to shoot it, but in realistic you don't get that, which is why I'm donking a lot of my shots, as a lot of people are donking shots onto me. So it comes into a lot of the idea that it's hard to take this thing out even more, because it's hard to be even more accurate, even with those guns that the Panzer III has, which have a muzzle, the APCR shell, which has 1,180 meters per second of muzzle velocity. It's still going to be hard to penetrate this thing. Another thing that realistic has over arcade is obviously the idea of aircraft milling about. Well, the KV-1 is not exactly a small tank, and when you come up on a map like this, it is pretty obvious where it is. Like, if it's on a road, you're not exactly going to be able to hide in a bush. This isn't a T-34. This is a KV-1. So, planes can be a bit of a problem, but because of that BR of 2.7, there aren't many people who fly big bombers, and when you look at the Germans, you think about the early Heinkels. Well, yes, they could take out a KV-1, but think about all the artillery around. That's gonna, put a dent in them. So, what else do they have? The Stukas. I still don't really rate Stukas in realistic battle. 1 250 kilo bomb, yeah, on the back of a KV-1, it's gonna take it out, but accuracy is key, and it is very hard to do. So, on maps like this, it's not that much of an issue. Obviously, on maps like Kursk, it is going to be an issue. And another thing is, it's quite hard to actually get into a game, I find, around this BR, because a lot of people don't like facing the early T-34s and KV-1s, and I can't blame them. They're very, very good tanks, and as you can see in this game, we just stomped. there was nothing the Germans could do to stop us. Like, there was a guy at the start who took out a KV-1, and well done to him, but that was about it. Everything else we just walked on. Obviously, the Germans start getting the power. I did that, by the way, because we'd won the battle. But anyway, the Germans start getting very powerful around, tier 3, tier 4, stuff like that. But early on, the Russians do have the advantage. That's just how it is. So, with this KV-1, getting into battles in realistic and simulator can take a while, but it is obviously definitely worth it. The fact that you come up against tanks that can't hurt you, but you can hurt them. The fact that you can basically just dictate an area of the battlefield just because you're a heavy tank, and it's going to be a lot harder to take you out. A lot of people will go after you instead of the people next to you, basically because they see you as the bigger threat. And if they don't, and they go after everybody else first, well then, you're free to do whatever the hell you want, which is always nice. Ammo-wise, this thing does get some armor-piercing ballistic cap stuff, and also some APHE. I mainly carry APHE because the armor-piercing ballistic cap, it only really has up to 5 to 10 millimeters more of penetration, and it has the same muzzle velocity. So, shooting it at longer ranges doesn't really make a difference. But we do find ourselves on Kursk, which is nice to see in a realistic battle. It's not just in simulator battles. But I usually carry more APHE than APBC, just for that reason, the fact that it has a high explosive. And yes, a 26-ton tank just flipped me. Because weight physics. Like, I'm sure they'll get it right. I'm sure Gaijin will get it right when they have to. But a KV-1 should not be tossed up into the air by a T-34. If anything, that T-34 should ram into the side of the KV-1 and bounce up off of it. But, they'll get it sorted eventually. Now, I was worried when I came onto Kursk with the KV-1, because as I said before, this is not a small tank. This is probably the biggest tank you're going to come up against around this BR. Obviously, there's the KV-2 later on, the Tigers, the Panthers, they get big. But the KV-1 stands out like a sore thumb when it comes to this BR of 2.7. You look at the T-34s, they're very small, Su-76, once again, absolutely tidgy. And right now, I was basically just sorting out my headphones and stuff, but I don't want to get into the Battle of Kursk too fast. I want to get the Germans into a position where I'm able to effectively fire on them. As I said, this gun is not very good at long ranges. So what do? We don't engage at long ranges. We get up and get at them in their face. We use as much cover as we can between the target and ourselves to get up to them, and then we fight on our terms. A lot of War Thunder is using a tank's strengths to its advantage, and basically making sure that your weaknesses cannot be found out. The KV-1's weakness, aircraft, you can't really do much about that, except maybe hide under a tree if you want, but its armor penetration at long ranges is pretty shoddy. Even though you come up against German tanks which do not have a lot of armor, it is still better to get up close and personal with them, because your accuracy will be better, your penetration will be better, and you should do damage to them as well. Another thing to talk about the KV-1 L-11 in realistic is this idea of turret elevation and depression, the gun mantle basically. The depression is not great, I believe it's -5, which is pretty shoddy, but to be honest, it doesn't really make a difference. The biggest thing to me with this thing is the fact that it takes a long time to move the turret up and down. Side to side, it's not too bad, but up and down is pretty shoddy. Now, as you can see, I'm getting used to the oh, and somebody's trying to hit me. I'm getting used to the muzzle velocity on this thing. I basically started using this tank straight after using the AUSF L with its 1100 meters per second APCR round. So this thing basically has about it has just a bit more than half of the muzzle velocity of those rounds, so you have to get used to them. Obviously, you can use the indicators on the scope, as you can see, that works pretty well. But, you know, you're never really going to be that accurate with this thing unless you're a crack shot. It's kind of like when you use heat rounds. It's very hard to be accurate with them unless you're at short ranges. But as you can see, I'm using this hill to take cover. I'm making sure to get into a position near my allies, even though most of them are in planes. At least this guy is in a tank. I'm basically using this hill to put myself between the tanks and myself. The problem with attacking at short range is the fact that they'll be able to penetrate you as well. If you are at long ranges, it's very, very hard to pen a KV-1 in realistic. But if you're at short ranges, it's a hell of a lot easier. It's a hell of a lot easier to be more accurate, aiming at certain modules. It's very easy to hit tracks and stuff like that, where at long ranges it's tough. So you're basically going, okay, I'm allowing them to be able to penetrate me, but I'm getting into a position where I know I can penetrate them. So in effect, it is better to be closer to the enemy than be far away. If you are one of those cautious players, which I can completely understand in the KV-1, because the thing is, the KV-1 only has one life. Like, a lot of these tanks in realistic and simulator have two. The medium tanks have 2 spawns, and the light tanks, I believe, have 3, even though I've never tried it. So, being cautious in the KV-1, I can completely understand, but I'm just not really that kind of player. I like to put the team on my back and then basically dictate the speed of the game by what I do. Like right now, I know where the enemy is. I put myself into a position where I can spot the enemy. I know if they come up, and if they come up, I can pop over this hill and take some shots at them. And being at the front of the battlefield means I can do that. And as you can see, engaging at short ranges is easily a great thing to do in this KV-1. And I have no idea what the enemy was doing. They were still trying to shoot at AI tanks instead of actual, humans. So if I was going to give them some positive criticism, I'd say maybe try and shoot at the human players before you try and take out the AI. But as you can see, I can easily donk shots off these guys and kill them in a few hits, even one hit. And because I've used this hill, they didn't know I was there. And even if they did know I was there, well, yeah, they didn't, they didn't, look for me or didn't shoot at me. Another thing is, I can't play defensive in a KV-1 because I know if there are aircraft overhead in realistic, and if I play defensive, don't really do a lot for my team, and then get taken out by an aircraft, I feel pretty bad. Like, I feel like I've wasted my tank. So I'd rather take the risk on going forward and being shot by enemy tanks than sit back, not do anything, and just watch myself get taken apart by aircraft. 20mm can penetrate the top of this thing. So, yeah, they're still going to do damage to you, as you'll see later on in this video. But it is a tank which gives you the opportunity to force a battle. It's kind of like with the Panzer IV Aus F2, the whole idea that one shot can make a massive difference. It can change the way a battle goes. And with the KV-1, it's more like your positioning can change a battle. Like if you stay in the center and take out a lot of tanks and then push the issue forward, then you can do a lot for your team. It's much more of a up-close and personal tank. And that does mean that sometimes you do have to throw caution to the wind. And I know a lot of players don't like that idea because, you have to pay for repair costs. You have to, basically throw your tank and hope that something happens. But sometimes it pays off. And to be honest, for me, most of the times it pays off in this. Because you come up against enemies who look at a KV-1 and don't really know what to do, don't really know where to shoot it, or they try and shoot the areas on you which is weak for a T-34, like the idea of the side of the turret or the driver's port. And on the KV-1, they are still pretty strong. compared to a T-34. Even hitting it flat, it still doesn't make a lot of difference. Now, as you can see, I'm taking some pot shots at some AI because there are no immediate enemies in human players, and there was some kind of plane which just dived and fell out of the sky. Now, the reason I'm reluctant at pushing forward at this moment is because most of my team is still in goddamn planes. And the thing is, if I push the issue by myself, it won't work. As I said, the KV-1 is a great tank for pushing, but it needs support from its T-34s, from its tank destroyers. This is not a one-man army. This is not something that can just push through the German lines and back in home for tea. It's a tank which needs support. A few other tanks don't need support, like you could say something like even some of the T-34s. They can just go ham, and they don't really need that. They don't really need the people behind them. They can just go forward and take everybody out, where the KV-1 cannot, because even though it has a lot of advantages, it has some weaknesses as well. I mean, the fact that the turret doesn't turn very fast, the fact that it's a large tank, it's a big target, its tracks are weak, the fact that if you get around it, it's an easy pen on the back of the turret. All of these things you have to take into account when you push forward. When you push forward and you don't have any support, it makes it very easy for the enemy to outflank you and just outdo you, because once there are two tanks engaging you, there are not much you can do. You can't point your gun at both of them. And because its turret rotation is very slow, it is easy to keep up with that and just keep circling the tank. I've seen a lot of people do it. And at that short of range, even though you have a lot of armor, it's not going to stay up. It's not going to help you. So you got to take stuff like that into account. But there is an AI who's trying to trade shots with me, and I suppose the good thing about AI is that they don't do a lot of damage to you. They just basically tell you where they are. Maybe they need to change that, make AI at least mean something, but that's their decision. If they did mean something, Kursk would be completely void, because all the AI players would destroy the allied players pretty easily. So, thoughts about the KV-1. The whole point of its BR. I've talked about it earlier on, but another point is that it leads you into this area where you're between the German, early tanks, like the early Panzer IIIs and IVs, but it also puts you on the other side between the L and the F2 and the G. So you can still get into matches with those. I mean, the G is 4.0, this thing is 2.7. The F2 is 3.0, I believe, and the L is 3.3. And most of the time you're going to come up against German players who have those, because they're just the better tanks than the other ones. And they realise they have to come up against KV-1s, and they realise they have to hurt them. It is so annoying when you are firing at a tank and you can't pen it. All you can maybe do is take a track off, which is it's awful. It's kind of like if in arcade, if I'm driving the KV-1 and there's a KV-1 who's just looking at me, and we're basically just trading shots. There's not much I can do against him, and there's not much he can do against me. And basically you're just hoping for that lucky shot to go through. And yeah, that's kind of annoying. Looking at the other ammo types, you obviously have high explosive and some shrapnel stuff, I believe. So maybe the shrapnel shell would have been good against this plane, but to be honest, this plane ain't gonna do much against me. And it is nice that I can just try and shoot at planes when the German army on the ground has decided to give up against the superior power. But this is another thing I wanted to talk about. I can see on that ledge, or that hill over there is an F2. If I was in an F2 myself, I would back myself to shoot that and hit the guy. Whereas, because I'm in a KV-1, I know that engaging at that distance, I'm gonna struggle to hit. Not struggle to penetrate, just hit the damn thing. So, maybe that will be a problem for some players who like the idea of long-range combat. I know I'm one of those players. I like that when I'm playing the Germans, because that's what most of the German tanks were designed for. But a lot of the Russian tanks are best at mid to low ranges, and that's just something you got to take into account. The KV-1, yes, it will bounce shots from 1 kilometer away, but you're not going to be able to shoot back and do anything. Like, you'll bounce your shots as well. Another thing is, obviously, if you get any engine damage or transmission damage, well, this thing becomes a boat. It moves so slow when you're moving about, especially in realistic, where you really feel it. And as you can see, this guy in the HE-112 is able to shoot me and do damage, hitting my tracks mainly, I believe. So even the 20mm cannons can do a bit of damage to you, which is always nice to see. Like, I wouldn't like my supposed OP tank to not be able to take damage from stuff like that, because so far in this battle, all I've taken damage from is my own T-34, who ran into me. But yeah, we're trading a few blows. He won't be able to kill me, I won't be able to kill him, but you know, it's still nice to have. As I said, there's nothing else really going on in this battle. We've basically broken through their forces. The Russian players have ditched their aircraft and have come to support me in their tanks, in their droves, and we broke through their lines pretty easily. And it doesn't really matter what this guy can do. All he can really do is take off my armoured skirts on my tracks and maybe blow a track off, which is only going to stop the inevitable. The gun on this is, I don't know, it's not a great gun. The L-11 is not a brilliant gun, but it does its job. Like, it is able to penetrate at decent distances. It's able to fire those APHE rounds, which the Russians love so much, and its muzzle velocity is, you know, kind of circumspect, I'd say. But it does its job. At low ranges, it does its job. When you're looking at a kilometer, no way. Like, this gun is not a long-range gun. Its accuracy is not good enough. Its barrel is very short, and that does contribute to it. And there's some nice animations there on those troops. It's nice to see little stuff like that. As you can see, the AA gun. This is one of the first times I've actually been able to break through the lines in the KV-1 and just see the rest of the battlefield. But as you can tell, turning the turret to engage enemies, even in the air, and getting the gun pointed up is tough. So if you get caught into a position where you do get ambushed or you do get flanked in this thing, you're going to struggle. I mean, it is a heavy tank. It's not going to be the fastest thing in the world, but it would be nice if the turret rotation was a bit faster. But what you're going to do? A big weak spot in realistic is obviously the back of the tank. So what do? You make sure that the enemy never has the back of your tank. It's very easy to set on fire from the sides and the rear, and the turret's back is very circumspect, even though it has a lot of armor. I'm guessing it's because it isn't slanted at all, that it is easy to be penned and easy to knock out your crew. But that's just my opinion. That seems to be where I take the most damage, but what can I say? I can't really bitch about this tank, because when you look at it, you have so much armor, you have a decent gun, your speed is okay, you know, everything is either average or great, so there's nothing to really complain about. The only thing you can complain about is, I suppose, if people decide to flank you and actually kill you how you were supposed to be killed. But after that battle on Kursk, let's get on to the final verdict. So on to the final verdict, where I'll be discussing the strengths and weaknesses that I believe the KV-1 L-11 has. So let's get on to the strengths. You have enough armor to trade shots effectively and win. This is one of the most heavily armored tanks at this BR and tier. So use that to its advantages, trade shots, win the game. You can dictate the speed of a battle. Having the ability of being able to move back and your team follows you, and move forward and your team follows you, means that you can use tactics and push forward against the enemy and win in that way. You can ram and get up close and personal with other tanks and have some fun. As you saw in the arcade battles and also in the realistic battles, getting up close and personal is what this KV-1 is good at. It has the armor to prevent people really damaging it while you can dish out with your gun. Your tracks eat a lot of damage, so most of the time when you are hit, it will do no damage. Even if you penetrate this thing, you aren't going to do a lot of damage, which is a great thing, and it doesn't take long to repair those tracks. Your gun is good enough to penetrate anything you will come up against, and with APHE rounds you can decimate enemy tanks. Obviously this is talking about short range to mid range. Long range you are going to struggle a bit, but the thing is, with those APHE rounds you are going to do some serious damage if you penetrate the enemy tanks. So let's get on to the weaknesses. Poor maneuverability means that it is easier for enemy tanks to encircle you and pick you apart. Obviously this is a problem. This is going to happen with most heavy tanks in the game. That's how they were taken out in real life, and that's how they're going to get taken out in the game. At long ranges, this tank struggles with penetrating enemy armor and also accuracy. Yep, that's a real problem. Penetration is obviously a big thing in this tank. At long ranges, even though the Germans don't have a lot of armor, it's still quite hard to penetrate. Without support, you are basically a little fish in a big sea. Even though you're a heavy tank, it's very hard to push forward without the support of your team, because the thing is, you are a big target. People will target you because you're a big guy. People will go after you, and without the supporting guns, you're basically just going to be left in the middle of a field getting 10 people shooting at you. Low muzzle velocity from the gun means that it can be hard in realistic and simulator modes to be accurate. With the low muzzle velocity, it means that you have to arc your shots more, which is tough to do if you are used to the German larger caliber guns. Having no artillery support can mean that your vision and your abilities can be weakened. I know a lot of people in realistic and simulator mode use artillery support to look around the map. They also use it to, stop tanks camping, and unfortunately in the KV-1 you don't have this. But overall, I'd say the strengths of this tank outweigh the weaknesses. It is going to be probably the first heavy tank you do unlock, so it's nice to get that feeling of what a heavy tank should be like, what it should do and where it should go at a lower BR, where you're not going to get crucified by very, very good players. But anyway, thank you for watching, and have a great day.